Great, we're now being recorded. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again, albeit virtually rather than in person. This is the third PAM, Police and Crime Commissioners Accountability meeting since I was elected last May. And obviously this is the main forum in which I carry out my statutory duty to hold Norfolk Constabulary to account. And this is done in public, hence we're recording this and it will be released to YouTube in due course. Once again, we're meeting virtually. I noted that when I introduced the previous meeting, I said we would look at meeting in person this time. The situation is such that we've decided to continue to meet virtually. I still hope that our next meeting might be in person and we'll make a decision at an appropriate moment. I think after that brief introduction, let's go straight on into the agenda. The first one is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies from the constabulary side, Paul?
Yes, we do, from ACC Eamon Bridger, who is on annual leave today, Commissioner.
Thank you. Any from ours, Mark? I think we're all here.
No apologies today, Commissioner.
Grand, thank you. Moving swiftly on then, item 2, declarations of personal and or prejudicial interest. We've had no declarations previously. Has anything changed? Anyone wish to declare anything in relation to today's agenda? I see no hands going up and lots of negative type nods. Okay, we'll assume that there are no declarations to be made, and I'll move on to item 3, minutes of the last meeting, which happened on the 20th of October last year. Minutes are in the papers beginning at page 3. The first point I've got arises from page 8. It's not a highlighted action, but the Chief Constable was going to provide figures for cases of violence against women and girls. And I'm not sure that we've published those figures, and I wonder, Paul, if you're in a position to provide them now.
Yes, happy to. I'll separate this out, Commissioner. First, if I look at domestic abuse, between 1st November 2020 and 31st of October 2021, there were just under 14,000 domestic abuse cases recorded in Norfolk, of which 70% were against female victims. So that's 9,802 in a year period of domestic abuse cases. Of that number, 823 resulted in prosecution. There were numerous other outcomes for the other cases. If I then look specifically at serious sexual offences, which includes rape, within the same year time period, there were just over 2,300 serious sexual offences, of which 1,935, so 83%, were against female victims. During that same period, so far, and that's a critical word here, so far 58 prosecutions. As you are aware, Commissioner, these investigations take a long period of time, so the number of prosecutions will increase in due course. So that's just the prosecutions so far. The question asked about violence against women and girls, it is perpetrated in other crime types, but I think for the purpose of the question, I think to focus on domestic abuse and sexual violence probably gives a detailed enough picture, I would hope, as to the situation in Norfolk.
Thank you. I'm mindful the question was particularly about violence against women and girls, but if I can just turn the figures on their head and clarify whether the remaining 30% of DA cases, domestic abuse cases, and the remaining, my maths isn't brilliant, 17% of serious sexual assault cases were either not specified or were they against men, because we've traditionally regarded domestic abuse particularly as primarily men and boys on women and girls. But if there's 30%, that's a rather greater proportion if we don't clarify it.
And you're correct, it's males and the cases where the gender of the victim is not available on the records.
Okay.
So it does highlight that yes, domestic abuse and sexual offences is not just a crime affecting women.
Yeah. No, that's useful and important, actually, because my impression was very much that domestic abuse was primarily male on female, and this suggests that there is a changing picture, and it's useful to have that context. Thank you.
Yes, and it's probably important to say, Commissioner, within that there will be a significant number of counter allegations where one party alleges an incident and victim and offender are interchangeable, and that's quite a common phenomena.
So the statistics you've given are not necessarily separate incidents. There could be two reports relating to one instance.
Multiple reports, quite likely. So it would be quite a common occurrence for police officers to attend an address, to perhaps record from one victim an offence of an assault, perhaps a stalking or coercive behaviour offence, and maybe even a property offence. Let's say an item of a phone or something has been damaged in the incident. So you could have 3 or 4 crimes from one victim and then flip it, and suspect could become victim in the counter allegation, and we could be recording multiple crimes for one incident. And that's very relevant when it comes to outcomes as well, because when it comes to prosecution, the CPS may well say to us, well, amongst that group of 8 crimes that you've had from that one incident, one of them should advance to prosecution. But that to us looks like a low detection rate, even though fundamentally we've got to the point of delivering some form of justice. So with these statistics, I think the value of a detection rate on its own is somewhat limited.
Yeah, interesting point. Thank you for that. We could debate this for some considerable time, but that's probably for another occasion. Moving on then, and I'm going to page 13. There's an action there, and do we have the results for public engagement and police visibility through the Park Walk and Talk scheme? Have I got that page reference right?
I believe that we've previously submitted that data, Commissioner.
We gave a presentation in SGB, Chief, around that about a month ago.
Okay, so we've got the information from SGB that we can publish, because as this has come up in the minutes of this forum, we ought to put a note out. So we'll make a note to carry that information and publish on the website so that we can complete that action, and then we can close that action down.
Yes, and sorry, Commissioner, and worth adding, we last week we put out a press release to all local media outlets about the activity that we've undertaken through Park Walk and Talk and Street Safe. So we've been we have shared that data publicly as well.
Yeah.
Just to signpost anyone who is tuning in towards the EDP website where that data can be found.
Yes, I saw that article. I thought it was very helpful. Thank you. Good. Those are the only thoughts I had from the minutes of the last meeting. Are there any points, issues or questions from the virtual floor about the minutes? Lots of heads, no hands going up. Okay.
No, Commissioner, would you mind just if I add a little bit in furtherance to the answer around violence against women and girls? The impression that I would want to clearly, or the position I clearly want to paint, is that women and girls are nonetheless disproportionately overrepresented in those domestic abuse figures. I gave an explanation as to how, as to what makes up that missing 30/17%. but it is overwhelmingly disproportionately directed towards women, just for clarity.
No, that's useful. And for the wider audience, I just flag up the fact that you and I in our regular coffee meetings have discussed the priority that we need to give to violence against women and girls, both in line with the statistics you've given us, government policy, and indeed public demand. So that is on the agenda, and indeed is reflected in your bid for the precept in increased resources, which just signals the importance you're placing on it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Grand. Okay, that concludes item 3. Gavin's hand's gone up, sorry, before we move on.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think back to that point about disproportionality, just to make the floor aware that a detailed analysis of domestic abuse, serious sexual offence data is undertaken on a quarterly basis by the county-wide domestic abuse and sexual violence group, and that breakdown is presented and analysed at that group, and that's shared by myself and Andy Collar, Head of Safeguarding from Norfolk Constabulary.
Graham, thank you. No other hands going up. Okay, let's close item 3 and go on to item 4, which is the COVID-19 updates. Who wants to lead on this?
Happy to, Commissioner. It will be a reasonably brief update. Everyone listening in will know that we've been in the middle of the Omicron peak over the month of December and into January. For the constabulary, if I focus internally first of all, we've peaked at around a 9.6% sickness rate associated with Omicron. We contingency planned for a significantly higher rate than that. And as a consequence, there has only been minimal impact on our operational activity as a result of that level of sickness. We have at times had to move resources around the constabulary to be able to match demand. And there have been occasional days within our control room where sickness has meant that we have not been able to answer calls as quickly as we would have wished. But generally, it's a very positive picture in terms of how the constabulary has coped with that most recent wave. I'm pleased to report that as within the county of Norfolk, infection rates fall, so have our internal infection rates are starting to reduce down. We're probably at the time now where if there's any bounce that occurs because of schools returning, that we would start to see that. So we keep a very keen and close eye on it, and we still do experience reasonably regular outbreaks in departments across the constabulary. However, the occurrence of them is reducing in frequency. So as I sit here now, I'm optimistic that we've seen the worst of the Omicron wave, but I do say that touching wood. I have seen projections locally from public health which suggest a number of scenarios that could pan out in the months ahead. But in terms of operational viability, I'm more than confident that we can cope with all of those scenarios. We are now giving very close consideration as to what working life should look like in the constabulary over the coming weeks, months, and indeed long term. You'll be aware that the pandemic has enabled us to look very differently at how we do our business, particularly in a number of our back office functions, and has identified areas where we can become more efficient and make savings that we can redirect towards frontline policing. And under Peter Jasper's stewardship, our modern workplace programme will be looking to make the most of those opportunities as they appear. External focus, we really have not been looking at any form of enforcement around any of the regulations. You'll be aware that they're changing tomorrow. We have been very much expecting the communities to conform to the regulations and the requests of the government, and they have done so. So from an enforcement perspective, there's been little need for any activity on our behalf, which I'm also pleased to report.
Thank you. It occurs to me that this has been a standing item on the agenda for a while, for obvious reasons, but in the spirit of trying to return to normal, would we be content to take this item out of the agenda in future and report by exception as needed? My sense is that the day-to-day management of the issues arising from COVID is really a matter for you and the constabulary to deal with in-house. But if a member of the public was interested and wished to ask a question, they could obviously do so when we invite public questions. And of course, if there was a future issue that required a statement for the public to benefit from you, we could add it back into the agenda. So if you're content, I'm suggesting we take this out of the standing agenda in a spirit of returning to normality.
I'd be happy with that, Commissioner. I think the time is right.
Grand. We'll take that as an action then. Thank you. Good. Moving on then to item 5, questions from the public. We've had quite a lot of questions in the first and second pans, but on this occasion we've only received 2. I suggest that the low number in comparison with previous pans is probably because a large number of comments and indeed questions were made or asked during the public consultation on the proposed precept increase. The Chief Constable and I go before the Police and Crime Panel on the 1st of February, where we'll answer those. So for today, I've just got the 2. The first relates to vulnerable road users. And the question is, over the last year, there's been a significant increase in intimidation and in some cases deliberate attacks on vulnerable road users, mostly cyclists, but also pedestrians and horse riders. In most cases, the cyclist, pedestrian or rider was using the road perfectly legally. Using a motor vehicle as an offensive weapon is clearly an offence. And so will Norfolk Constabulary take this issue seriously and act on reports of such incidents in a timely manner?
So I'll respond to that question, Commissioner. There's a few parts to it. Taking the last part first, really, we will take reports of collisions involving all members of the public very seriously, and particularly when they involve vulnerable road users. We have a number of initiatives that we plan throughout the year, and I'll give a brief overview in a moment, that seeks to both educate motorists and protect vulnerable road users to do our best to make our roads as safe as possible. What I would say is that the statement in the question relating to a significant increase in intimidation and sometimes attacks on vulnerable users is not made out within our data. Now, I myself have seen occasional incidents, and those occasional incidents have received some media attention. So they may well be the source of a perceived increase, and I can understand why that would be perceived, but our data does not support the significant increase that the question would suggest. But nonetheless, we would take any report seriously. When it comes to killed and seriously injured cases on the road, which are the ones that will obviously be of most concern to us, we do record data on the number that include motorcyclists, pedal cyclists, pedestrians, and horse riders. If I was to compare year 2020 to 2021, there has been a 19% increase in the number of killed and seriously injured incidents involving motorcycles, all taking us to a number of 72 in the year, albeit that's below a 5-year average of 77. So an increase from last year, but below the 5-year average. In terms of pedal cyclists, a reduction in 2021 compared to 2020 from 54 down to 46. And again, that's below a 5-year average of 51 such cases. And when it comes to pedestrians, a reduction of 48 cases in 2020 to 39 in 2021. And again, that's below a 5-year average of 56. So some positive figures when it comes to accidents involving killed and seriously injured offences, including vulnerable road users. And just to finish on that point, we have no record of killed and serious or killed or seriously injured cases involving horse riders across that 5-year period. However, it's important that we keep that direction of travel and that level of safety. So with our partners from the County Council, we're holding numerous safe rider courses each year, which continue to educate motorcyclists, because we know that they are at particular risk on our roads, and that educates around riding techniques and safety. We will be holding numerous close pass events during the year 2022 across all parts of the county, and these are aimed at addressing the behaviour of drivers who fail to give appropriate space and distance to cyclists when they overtake them, and we'll be looking to expand close pass to horse riders. And to ensure that we do that in the right way, contact is being made with the British Horse Society on how we can support riders on our rural roads, because we do understand that that is a particular concern for horse riders. We aim to promote that activity through press releases throughout the year, and it will be in particular a priority for the roads and armed policing team and the road casualty reduction team. Motorcyclists will be working on both of those initiatives. Operation SNAP has been running for several years, and through this we encourage cyclists and motorcyclists to send in footage from their helmet cams or dash cams, as the case may be. And where that footage does meet evidential threshold, we will prosecute offenders. So we are geared up to absorb that sort of material. And you will know that in the coming weeks we will be looking again as a partnership, as part of a partnership, as to how the funds accrued through the cameras that exist across the county will be spent to further enhance safety on our roads, and we'll be looking at proposals for that in due course. Finally, you'll be aware that there has been some press around updates to the highway code, which will see more prioritisation given to vulnerable road users on the road, and we will be looking at how we can add our own communications messages to those new updates, so that there's clarity around the county as to what those changes to the highways code really mean. So a lengthy answer, Commissioner. If there's any supplementaries, happy to take them.
No, I did sort of have a couple of supplementaries on my scratch pad, but you've anticipated me and given the responses, which is great. Thank you. So nothing else from the floor. Let me go on to the second question from the public. This relates to the use of body-worn video cameras. The question that was actually presented may refer to a specific instance, and as I've said before, this is not a forum to hear specific complaints, and if a member of the public wants to make a complaint, they're welcome to do so. So I'm going to generalise just to ask what the policy is for the use of body-worn cameras. The concern raised in the original question referred particularly to officers working alone and the reliability of oral evidence, if not backed up by video evidence.
Again, happy to take that one. If I may, just on the point of complaint, should a complaint wish to be made, just so that we're very open about this, that can be done online via the Constabulary website, phone call to 101, in writing to the Professional Standards Department at our headquarters, or also by email, the email address being psd, Papa Sierra Delta, @norfolk.police.uk. So they are the mechanisms through which a complaint can be made, or indeed in person at any local police station. To the matter at hand with regards to the body-worn video, our policy and our expectation is that body-worn videos should be turned on, recording, when there is an evidence gathering opportunity in place. We do not have the body-worn videos on all of the time, simply because they would soon reach the capacity of what they could record, and we wouldn't have the space to hold all of the data. But as soon as an officer is engaged in something where there may be an evidence gathering opportunity, it should be on. Officers and members of police staff have been allocated personal issue body-worn videos, and that is all frontline officers are expected to wear the devices, and when using a policing power as well. For example, stop search, we would always expect that a body-worn video is on and recorded, and for the purposes of gathering evidence. We also ensure that body-worn videos are on when attending domestic abuse or suggested domestic abuse incidents. The point in the question is about single crewed officers. The nature of policing and the nature of the resources that we have available is that we cannot deploy officers double crewed to every incident. It would stretch us too thin, and actually it wouldn't be a good use of our resource, because so many of our encounters can be done by a lone single officer. In the last of these meetings, which was had a very strong focus on violence against women and girls, I explained the approach that we have and the direction that we've given to our officers about how they should react when someone does challenge them because they are concerned that they are operating alone. The clear position that we've given to all of our staff is that the responsibility is on the police officer. Firstly, to prove that they are a police officer. Where the case is where it is appropriate for the police officer to offer up alternative ways in which the encounter can be dealt with, i.e. Make an appointment time to meet at a police station, make an appointment time when another colleague may be available, or indeed ask for another colleague to come to the scene so that reassurance is given is given to the victim, witness, or person being dealt with on the street. But the short answer to the question is whenever we are gathering evidence, cameras should be on. And that's the expectation of officers. And we do dip sample this. And if they're not on, we are asking police officers why that is not the case.
Thank you. And just sort of one follow up from that. I mean, that one question suggests, and you picked up on, concerns about single officers going about. And that's obviously an echo of the terrible events surrounding the death of Sarah Everard. Beyond the one question, do you have a feel of how many other issues have been raised by the public? I mean, is this just one question, or are you aware of a sort of a trend of comment from the public on the point?
I'm not aware of a trend. I mean, I'll look for colleagues on the call, but I'm certainly not aware of any trend. I mean, Commissioner, you're right. I mean, this does come in the wake of Sarah Everard and that being just an awful case. In that matter, Wayne Couzens was off duty when the crime was perpetrated. It wasn't an on-duty crime. He used his warrant card, which makes it particularly concerning. But it was off duty. But nonetheless, no, I do not pick up a trend of concern on this. We are both your office and my office are keen to increase the visibility of policing across the county. And visibility is doubled if officers are single crewed as opposed to whether they're double crewed. So there's arguments either way on this. And I think in terms of that general feeling of safety around the county, there's more to be gained by my officers being single crewed and doubling our visibility than there is retrenching into double crewed cars.
and I would support that last point. The reason I asked the question is my impression through my mailbox is that when we met last time, this was a much greater issue, and that was reflected in the number of questions we had on the subject, whereas this time it seems that there is less concern from the public, and I would hope that that reflects a rebuilding of public confidence in that regard. I'm with you that we need to encourage visible policing, because ultimately the best way to rebuild public trust is to have officers out there being seen and doing their job on the ground in a thoroughly professional manner, and the vast majority of officers do exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grand. Those are the two questions from the public. So I think that brings us neatly on to item 6, good stewardship of taxpayers' money. And as last time, we've taken 3 issues or 3 reports set against the current police and crime plan, Lawn Green's police and crime plan, which remains in effect until the 30th of March. And my police and crime plan will come into effect thereafter. But the report for this item, stewardship of taxpayers' money, begins at page 17. First question I've got relates to the table on page 34, and it's to do with targets to attend emergencies. The target is 90%, attendance of 90% of emergencies within 15 minutes in urban areas and 20 minutes in rural areas. And I noted the figure of 88.7% on the table. So 2.3 below target, or 12.3% below 100% being demanding. And I just wondered what we could do to lift that figure above the targets, and how long you might envisage such remedial action taking to achieve the target.
Commissioner, I'll invite Nick Davison to answer this one, if I may.
Please, Nick.
Commissioner, yes. So, I mean, in terms of the papers, that's page 34 in that last table where we've got a percentage of emergency targets at 88.7 in the last 12 months. I mean, the paper goes on to describe how that's then split down in terms of obviously our urban response target and our rural response target. And the real issue here in terms of bringing it below that 90 rates is the rural target, which currently in that 12-month period under examination to November 2021 is at 86.3%. So that's the fundamental issue in terms of what's going on in the county of Norfolk as it relates to our ability to respond to emergency calls within the time limits that we've set ourselves in terms of those challenges. And it is those rural response times that are actually the issues driving that current performance. So sadly, as with most things, the answer isn't straightforward. It's quite complex. It relates to a number of kind of separate and linked issues, really. But the constabulary is doing work in order to make sure that we can meet those challenges and where possible exceed them. But I think some of that context is probably helpful for the public, Commissioner, if I may. So, you know, as we know, the geography in Norfolk is a significant issue for us. So it's one of the largest counties in England. I think it's the 4th largest county, with lots of communities, and both the size of the county and the paper, actually the number of 999 calls has gone up from the previous year of some 43,000 to some 45,000. So an increase. Yes, obviously it had dropped during COVID previous years, but we're now back up to where we were pre-COVID levels in terms of calls for service for 999 emergency responses. And there is a growing trend actually of increasing demand for emergency calls on the officers. I think it would be fair to say, if you're to look into the table below on page 36, which shows you the 999 calls received from 2015 through to 2021, a reasonable soundbite is that 2021 kind of January 2019, January time is actually almost now as busy, if not busier, than what it was in the summertime in 2015, 2016, 2017. So that, you know, there's just that growing demand, which of course we have to manage and has an impact to pay too. So other things that are within this complex kind of response really relates to some of our own internal processes and how we deal with things. And these are the areas that we're really, you know, focusing in on to try and make sure that we can be the best that we can possibly be in face of all of those geographical and demand issues that I've just described. So the CCR, the control room itself, obviously it has a process and a system from the call that comes into the room through to the assessment of what that call is, you know, the threat, the harm, the risk, the prioritization, getting it on the system and then transferring it across the room to the dispatcher, for the dispatcher to then assess it, digest it, then get the most appropriate resource to get to that incident and assign them. And then, of course, they've got to travel from wherever they are to get to the incident itself. Those are some of the things. So we work very hard in trying to make that process within the room and getting that call assessed and out of the room, and the officer tasked to go and actually start travelling towards the emergency as much as we can. So degrees of automation, performance targets within those processes themselves, the right training to be able to make sure that our control room staff are distilling the distinct necessary information and then quickly dispatching that onwards whilst they're still talking to member of the public, providing reassurance and updates as they're dealing with the emergency that they've called us for. There are targets in relation to that. There are performance, and there's training to make sure that that's the best it can possibly be. One thing that we do have as a challenge is when officers actually arrive at the scene, there's still, sadly, in terms of technology, a need for them to manually update that they've arrived at the scene to stop that clock which drives these targets and the response performance behind that. So of course, if they're responding to an emergency whereby, you know, there's a fight in progress or something that's really significant and they need to get out of that car, there are times when actually the officer isn't, you know, minded to just press a button, which is what they have to do in terms of what they're faced with. So you can see a delay as a consequence of that, and then that gets built into the performance issues. Now we're working quite hard to see if there's a technology solution to be able to deal with that and get that automated through GPS. But again, that's just ongoing work in respect to dealing with that. Driver training is another dynamic to this. We've obviously got more members of our frontline policing staff now in terms of new police officers through the Uplift programme. That's very, very welcome, absolutely welcome. But of course, there's challenges in those individuals trained to the required standard to be able to response drive, and I think we've spoken about that in the past, Commissioner, in terms of that. But the Constabulary has made the investment and an uplift in the number of driving instructors, in terms of 5 extra driving instructors to increase our capacity and ability to train those police officers so they can respond on emergency blue light runs. That's a programme of work that will see us being able to continue to get the right people with the right training in a position to be able to respond to deliver against these requirements in terms of getting to these incidents within the target time. But of course, what we have also seen at the same time is an increase in the requirement for driving standards. And of course, the Constabulary needs its officers to drive to arrive. So it's about making progress, obviously, you know, to support the member of the public, but not doing so recklessly, and making sure that the officers drive to arrive on those particularly challenging roads. That part plays a part in terms of performance issues as well. And then I think that the biggest kind of area is when we analyse what's going on, we do see some hot spots where it is particularly challenging around the county. So there are areas around north of Norwich, in the rural areas between Norwich and Aylsham, where actually the response time is quite challenging because a lot of the officers were based at Aylsham Police Station, and of course the travelling time there was problematic. So we've taken a decision to move officers through to the Taverham, the Thorpe Marriott station, and split that response base as a consequence of trying to tackle the response times. That has seen some improvements as a consequence. The wider estate strategy is researching, you know, where should our estate sit in terms of actually the county of Norfolk to be able to deal with some of these things. And I know that Peter Jasper and his estates team will be bringing proposals to you at some point in the near future about potential new police station sites, which will help again with our ability to be able to respond to these jobs in the areas where we know that the performance is a challenge to us in respect to that. Similar issues in South Norfolk around Toft Monks areas and those communities. So again, we've moved officers out of the Wyndham beat base here at the OCC, moved them to Poringland and reconstituted Poringland Police Station as a beat base. So again, seeking to adapt our deployments to improve our performances as we go along in respect to that. And I think the final thing I would say, Commissioner, as well, it's about the work that we're doing with your support in terms of exploitation of new technology and how new technology can obviously reduce the need for officers to return to the police stations to access the systems to continue with their work. And, you know, with the launch of the new mobile phone that will hopefully be delivered this year in terms of April, springtime, and the stability that will bring and the technology that will place in the hands of officers out on the front line in their communities will give them access, and much more better access than they've currently got and ever had before, to all their systems, so they won't have to keep coming back to police stations. So, you know, they can do what they need to do whilst actually out and about in the cars, in the communities, in visible and patrol, and working with the CCR colleagues about the GPS locations of all of our officers, actually use that fact and that new investment to be able to really kind of make sure that we do have officers in the right place where we can predict we're going to get 999 calls from in terms of the analysis that we also do. So look, that's a really long answer, but there's a lot of complexity to the issues in terms of managing performance. And I hope that I've, one, both explained the complexities, but two, given some information about how we monitor and how we tackle it and what's coming down the line for the future, particularly in being able to free officers from coming back to the stations.
No, it was really helpful. Thank you. One very small piece of detail. You mentioned the particular issue of Norwich out to Aylsham. Presumably that will be addressed when Broadland Gate opens at the end of, hopefully the end of this year, beginning of next.
So in part, the repositioning of Broadland Gate will be very helpful in respect to that, but actually it's the issue is more across north of Helsden and in and around the Taverham area and beyond Taverham, which is the particularly challenging area. And whilst Broadland Gate will help substantially, actually there's another area that we're having to deal with and think about. And what does that mean in terms of the police station that we've got servicing North Norwich at the moment, which is obviously at Hurricane Way, which is that rented property that we've got. And are there some options that we can bring to you about improving that estate location and the presence of policing within that part of North Norwich and the community that will also deal with these performance issues in terms of response times there too.
No, that's grand. Thank you. I'm very quickly going to jump ahead to page 45, which is the Rural Crime Report. There's a table there that basically looks at the Kings Lynn West Norfolk district and response times. And I assume that we've actually covered off that point in the answer you've just given. Do you need a moment to find it? It's the
No, I just can't get the mute button quick enough. Commissioner, to be frank, the answer that I've given you pretty much does cover those issues in relation to Kings Lynn and West Norfolk districts. You know, and I note that there's even less satisfactory performance during the period under investigation at 81.5%. But all those issues about road network, geography, particularly in the west of the county, still bear significant relevance. But again, we monitor it and we will deploy the nearest available resource because each of the cars are GPS tagged, and some of those advances that I'd earlier talked to you about in the previous linked item are as relevant to the issues in respect to Kingsland and West Norfolk as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It just made sense to address that point now rather than waiting till later and reprising the answer you've just given. Change tack completely and step back from that particular report. We're about, as I said in the introduction, to go to the police and crime panel for the precept for next year. But I wonder, I'm probably looking either back to the Chief Constable, or possibly to Peter Jasper, I wonder if someone could say a few words about last year's precept increase and how that increase has translated into effects over the ground over the last year. Can we give the public assurance that we have delivered what we promised we would deliver when we asked for the increase last year? Because I think that's a very good start point before we go to the panel this year.
Commissioner, happy to do so. To recap, last year there was a precept increase equal to 22p per week for Band B property and 29 pence for a Band D. The headlines as to why we asked for that increase was to keep service at its current level whilst dealing with increasing demand, but also to establish some dedicated activity dealing with dangerous domestic abuse perpetrators, and to also help with crimes which have a digital footprint. Specifically as to what we've done with that with that funding in the year gone by, you will be aware that we have been increasing the number of police officers in the organisation through the government's Uplift programme. That additional funding allowed us to bring forward much of that recruitment so that we had officers on the beat ahead of the new police education and qualifications framework arriving, where there'd be increased abstraction. We brought those officers forward in and early so that by the 31st of March this year, we are projected to have 1,791 police officers, which will be the highest number of officers in our history, and ensures that we are way above the government's uplift target for the county. So more officers available to be deployed to the types of incidents that Nick was just detailing on the last answer. We also invested additional funds into our control room with a particular aim of maintaining our excellent standards on 999 calls, but improving 101 service, recognising that too often callers were abandoning calls because of the length of wait for calls to be answered. It was not long ago that the abandoned call rate was getting close to 25% on some days. As a result, we are now getting that down to around about 5% of calls being abandoned. The average answering time for 101s is reducing all of the time. It has taken us a while to recruit and train the individuals that additional funding has allowed, but over the next couple of months we'll complete that recruitment and training so that level of performance will be maintained. So better performance on 101s, more officers on the beat. When it comes to digital investigations, we have recruited more police digital investigators. They are police staff roles that primarily work alongside detective constables who unlock the lines of inquiries from the increasingly complex nature of the crime that we are now investigating. Their particular expertise is around extracting evidence from mobile phones, tablets, laptops, computers, dash cams, etc. And their focus is on all sorts of criminality, from rape to fraud, to sexual offences to burglary. If I give you some very quick examples, the police digital investigators assisted detectives with initial inquiries into a rape last year, which led to the identification of further victims who previously not reported matters to policing, and led to the identification of victims of fraud and indecent images of children offences. The suspect in that case convicted of all counts only this month. Regarding burglary, the PDIs provided the critical evidence that led to a male who was sought for over a dozen burglary offences being convicted. And in regards to fraud, they have led our response to courier fraud cases. That's where elderly victims in particular are being scammed, being told to hand money over to bogus police officers. In those cases, our PDIs identified over 40 local victims who otherwise were not known to us, and their evidence led to the successful prosecution of 2 offenders for those awful crimes. Just 3 examples, but real world investigations where those police digital investigators are making a real difference to our ability to deal with the worst crime that we see within the county. On top of that, the precept enabled us to fund some additional specific posts around downloading evidence from phones. That helps us to ensure that victims' phones are returned to them in a quicker manner when they've been victims of rape and serious sexual offences. And then finally, on domestic abuse, we established a domestic abuse perpetrator scheme. Our ambition to put the pressure on perpetrators to complement our victim-led approach. To date, the team have been seeking to manage the behaviour of 34 of our most persistent and violent and high-risk domestic abuse perpetrators. That is a pilot approach for 2 years. We'll be evaluating the benefits and the outputs of the work, and at some point we will report that back to you more formally. Very early stages still in that pilot. But I hope what that does is set out in good and appropriate detail how we've sought to use that money very wisely. We know every time we do ask for more fundings, it's a big ask. But with the money that we were given last year, I believe we've made a real difference to our ability to tackle the issues that matter most to people in the county.
Gran, that's a really helpful sort of foundation on which we can then go into the precept round this year, so I'm grateful. In my enthusiasm, I rushed straight into questions without giving either you or Peter the opportunity to introduce the report. I just wondered, having done the questions, whether there was anything you wanted to say on the report itself, given that many of the public won't have actually seen it.
Well, I'll invite Peter to see if there's any highlights that he wants to cover off. Peter?
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Commissioner. I will just give a brief overview of the budget monitoring report, just for information for the people viewing this call later on. So the report that was attached outlines a forecast of spend to the year end based on spending to the end of November. And the report is showing a forecast constabulary underspend of 372,000. So that's just 0.2% of the constabulary net budget. I will just draw some highlighted items to your attention. So pay is forecast to underspend even with the higher level of recruitment we've got for officers. And as the Chief outlined, we're going to be over and above our uplift target and have the highest number of officers we've had in our history by year end. But that is offset by some vacancies in police staff roles. So overall, with pay, a slight underspend on that element. The income forecasts for the constabulary is significantly higher than budgeted. That's mainly due to some additional mutual aid recovery that we've been able to make this year, mainly as a result of the COP in Glasgow and the G7. The savings of 4 million that are outlined in the report, we are still on track to deliver that 4 million of savings, which has helped clearly balance the budget for this year. And it was a significant challenge that we put in place for the constabulary last year, and good news that we're still on track to deliver that. And finally, in terms of the finance report, before I can move on to the estates paper, as reported previously, there is slippage on the capital programme of around 2.3 million against a budget of 15.6 million. And as reported previously, that's due to the reprofiling of the construction scheme we've got around the Broadland police station. And that is just a consequence of it in terms of when the construction started, and that's due to go live and operational in November of this year, which moves me on to the estates paper. So just a couple of highlights from that. That is around the Broadland Gate construction. So that is underway, and as I said, due to go live operationally November 22, and we're still on track for that at the moment. And there are still ongoing works being undertaken at Heatherset in terms of the professional development centre that we've got there, predominantly for training student officers and giving them the best start to their journey with the constabulary. And we've got some forthcoming work in this year coming up in terms of refurbishment of the old junior school and the barn, and some repairs around the old hall roof. But we will bring more detail of that to your estates governance board in due course. All the other issues in there are for noting. So that's just some highlights.
Yeah, that's grand, thank you. One point of detail, just to clarify something in my mind. You touched on the small underspend, and did I understand you correctly that that is vacancies of posts, and therefore there isn't an underspend that can be reallocated because those posts should be filled and indeed will be filled in due course? Have I understood that correctly?
They should be and will be. We obviously we do have some turnover and some vacancies. It is higher in staff at the moment. We do look to see whether we can make best use of any underspends for one-off purposes around capital spend, or bringing forward some, for instance, purchase of vehicles if that's the right thing to do. At the moment, even with reviewing some of those one-off spending requirements that we can bring forward or make best use of, we're still forecasting that underspend of about 372,000.
Yeah, which across 187 million isn't too bad, and it's the right side of the line. Better a small underspend than a small overspend, or worse, a large overspend.
Yeah, in terms of the constabulary budget, 0.2%, so less than 1% underspend.
Yeah, am I right in thinking it was 0.4% last year? I'm not sure where I get that figure from. It's something that's in my mind. I may have got that completely wrong.
I'd have to double check, but it would have been something similar.
Yeah.
From Commissioner, from memory, it was less than that last year. By the time we got through to March, I think actually it was 0.1, but we can go away and check. Yeah.
No, I'm just trying to sort of compare what I recall, bearing in mind I was a candidate listening in last time rather than sitting in the hot seat, so I'll have to go back to notes. But yes, it's useful to know with the preset round coming up. Good, thank you. Is there anything else on that agenda item that anyone wants to raise? I think I've covered all the questions I've got.
And not from our side, thank you, Commissioner.
Grand, thank you very much. In which case, let's go on to item 7, supporting rural communities. And this time I will pause and have the constabulary a chance to introduce the item. I think this is the Deputy Chief Constable, isn't it, Simon Medjicks?
Commissioner, if I may, I was going to represent that paper.
Okay, no, delighted. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, so Commissioner, obviously you and your team have had access to it, but I was just going to propose, if it's okay with you, just to highlight one or two points within the paper.
Please, yeah.
So in respect to the bundle, page 40, clearly our main operation, Randall, is how we deal with our response to rural crime and rural communities. So we do have a dedicated community safety operational unit responsible for the delivery of that Operation Randall rural crime portfolio. So that looks at rural crime and community engagement within rural communities. It is a small team, supported, however, by a central community safety team that can go anywhere across the county. Chris Shelley, Constable Chris Shelley, is a real stalwart in respect to this, coordinating the work of the rural crime beat managers across the county, bringing together that good work, the initiatives, the engagement strategy, and applying his knowledge and his expertise with communities and within rural settings, whether they be villages and or the agricultural businesses that operate in there, sorting out early intervention, problem solving alike. And through that work and through his relationships and those of the officers that are the dedicated rural beat officers, such as Sue Mathis down at Harleston or Alex at Downham Market, they have built up an extensive network of policing contacts locally here in Norfolk, regionally and nationally, to help coordinate the efforts in the fight against rural crime. So we're really pleased with the on the ground work of those dedicated constables and the passion that they bring to tackling issues in respect to rural communities. I think the other thing I'd just like to highlight is the police use of drones. So all of the community safety operational unit staff are drone pilots, and drones are proving to be excellent in terms of our ability to see what's going on in really large expanses of rural areas in Norfolk, where there's limited population, and actually the drones are probably one of the best ways to kind of see what's going on and get ourselves out into those rural communities and being visible. And that's a really strong investment that the constabulary has made in that, and it's certainly been fully utilised as it relates to our fight against rural crime and communities. Now, beyond that, I'd like to draw your attention in the paper to some success that the constabulary has had in respect to a Home Office pilot. The pilot is called the Beyond the Visual Line of Sight drone pilot. Norfolk Constabulary has secured the ability to work with the Home Office and some significant funding to be able to support that pilot. And this is where the constabulary is going to be testing with Civil Aviation Authority partners and others actually how the police service as a whole might be able to continue to expand the use of drones beyond what the current legal parameters are. At the moment, Civil Aviation Authority rules and the law states that obviously the operator has to be able to visibly see the drone, and that's all linked into safety requirements that we have at the moment. But this pilot will enable us to test the safety and the technology and the ability to actually use drones up to 30 kilometres in distance. And that's a really exciting pilot that we've been able to secure in Norfolk. Norfolk communities will get benefit from that pilot. And obviously, should that then lead to a change in legislation framework, the whole of the UK policing service will see that benefit too, as that would then subsequently be rolled out. So that's really exciting to see that. And I'm sure we'll be able to give you a more in-depth briefing in respect to that shortly, should that be helpful to you.
Yeah, that certainly would. And it fits into the deeper question of police air capabilities that you're aware I'm also involved in at a national level.
So we obviously have a monthly Operation Randall newsletter that goes out to subscription members. Just a recent example of that is the Raptor persecution warrant that we were engaged with. The court result in relation to that was a theft of over 8,000 native British bluebells from Thurstford. So, you know, quite a specific crime, but absolutely a rural crime. And, you know, the work of the officers in terms of commitment to being able to solve that issue on behalf of the communities there in Thurstford is but one example in respect to that. We also continue just to remind Commissioner that we have the Community Rural Advisory Group, CRAG for short, and that brings together stakeholders from across rural communities on a quarterly basis to discuss the emerging and ongoing rural issues with an aim to kind of delivering a coordinated partnership response, and that continues to work effectively and efficiently. More generally, rural crime, actually, I think I would categorise it as quite stable at the moment. There's no significant increases noted during this period under examination here today. The NFU annual report would say that the cost of rural crime theft in Norfolk has fallen by 17% in terms of previous years. So again, you know, triangulating with an external body in terms of their data set driven by kind of insurance claims would support, I think, my earlier assertion about stable, no significant increases, in fact, potentially reduction. If I was to look to our performance stat, where I can get a minute by minute update in terms of the crimes being recorded, certainly since January last year till January today, if I think about agricultural crime, 30 recorded, theft of trailers only 27, lead theft only 9, outboard motors only 10, fuel thefts only 78. So each one of those are clearly significant to the victim, and I wouldn't want to undermine the importance of that to that individual. But seen in the wider context of the totality of policing and how large our rural communities are in Norfolk, actually the level of crime, respectively, hopefully those figures give you some sort of context in respect to that as well. I think I'll touch on current operations, if I may. Operation Galileo, Commissioner, if you remember, is our response to hare coursing in respect to the impact on rural communities. We continue to deal with that as robustly as we can. And at the moment, we've achieved about a 50% reduction in hare coursing in 2020-21 when you compare that to the previous season. And we're really pleased with that performance in respect to that, because we know that that's something that is particularly seen as an issue for our rural communities. And then finally, Commissioner, perhaps before I invite questions, Operation Huff, that's been launched here in Norfolk, and that's a response to the rising number of thefts in those high value agricultural GPS units that our farmers use in terms of their work. They sit on top of the tractors and obviously linked in with the sowing and the ploughing coordination of the sophistication today that goes on in terms of farming. Again, we're continuing to work and focus on that in terms of the level of service to the victims, providing them with information, supporting them with target hardening and crime prevention opportunities, and trying to drive that down. And I think if you go back to my earlier comment about agricultural machinery theft, a total of 30 across that year-long period, whilst this is significant and they're very expensive units and it's kind of growing, it does kind of fit within that context too. Very complicated issue here. It's managed by, in terms of criminality, organised crime groups, and most of the units end up in Europe in terms of second-hand market in Europe. So not easy to tackle, but we're certainly working as hard as we can in terms of prevention around that. So I think those are just some things that I'd like to draw your attention to, Commissioner, if you have any questions for me.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just a couple of points of detail. Going back to page 40, 2.3, you note in the report that there's been what looks like a significant reduction in duty hours on rural patrols by special constables. You cite 68.5%. I just wonder whether that figure was correct, and if so, why those hours have come down. Is there a COVID factor in that people who were previously furloughed from day jobs are no longer available for special constable patrols, or whether there's some other factor, and what we might do to reverse that if it is an issue.
So, Commissioner, you're quite right. And if you were to then look at the table on page 44, you can kind of see where it comes a number of hours at 307 hours, which delivers that 68.5% reduction that you referred to earlier on. So look, you're quite right. Issues such as COVID will have had an impact in terms of the ability of us to sustain earlier special constabulary patrol duties, undoubtedly. But the main issue here from the research that I've done is that we do have some difficulties in terms of the way in which the hours that our special constabulary colleagues record, being able to extract the data. So the data on page 44, the 307 hours, it isn't actually quite correct. I've had this looked at in the last couple of days, and whilst there's still some teasing out to be able to get to the absolute accurate figure of it, because I can't at the moment differentiate too easily from urban special constable patrol hours and rural patrol hours. But the data I have got for the entire year last year is some 2,423 hours of special constabulary time, so vastly in addition to the 307 hours reported here. So if, with your permission, Commissioner, I'd like to provide you with a written submission which will give you some further clarity around that, and hopefully some reassurance that we continue to support rural communities with the special constabulary. We're working with them and with our IT colleagues to deal with the technical issue in and around that. But what I would also like to say is that we've also recruited 15 rural crime champions to work across all of our policing districts, who can help and provide guidance and support to the special constabularies working on rural crime issues. So because obviously they are voluntary in nature, so we've got regular officers who can provide them with support in terms of making sure that they can be the best that they can be. And I'm really encouraged by that work too. And I am taking a change in terms of how we support recruitment of special constables and bring them into my local policing portfolio, and using my officers out on districts to be able to drive recruitment of special constables, hopefully even more than we currently do, with a view to increasing the number of special constables too as well. So I'm looking forward to doing that this year.
No, brilliant. In terms of the written submission, that would be very useful, thank you, because I'm really keen to reassure the rural community that we've got their backs, and so it'd be really good to put that accurate information out there for the record. On the increase in special constables, again, really good news, and I'll await developments on that with great interest. Chief Constable Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a final snippet just to add to Nick's commentary. We did have to suspend some of the training of special constables during the pandemic, but pleasingly, we've got 63 people in the recruitment pipeline to join the specials. 5 courses planned in the year ahead. Takes a while to get someone from first day on course through to ready to deploy onto streets. But actually, we're seeing a really pleasing pipeline, and I think the transition that Nick describes into the local ownership of that within his team will only help that further. So, a good opportunity, I think, for me just to thank all of the specials who do wonderful work for us and have done during the pandemic, and to put that on record. But secondly, to encourage more people to join us. It's a wonderful gateway into policing. It's a fantastic way of giving back to your community. More people look like they're wanting to join us, and we're keen to expand that even further.
And I would echo that wholeheartedly from my perspective. And it goes to a debate that you and I have been having over our coffee about how we address the public's concerns about the lack of police community support officers. And this concept of community specials seems to be a very viable way forward that will meet that requirement. And I look forward to developing that discussion as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Anything else on that item? Thank you. Right. Item 8, road safety. It's the third report against the current police and crime plan, and we're at page 47 in the papers. Who'd like to lead on introducing that?
I'll take that, Commissioner, if I may.
Please, thank you.
What I'll do, if I may, just to introduce the paper with a number of highlights. I suppose the first point that I'd like to make, although not necessarily represented in the paper, is just to confirm the maintenance of focus around road safety, both in terms of our policing numbers and commitment, and the way that we deliver road safety, both in terms of a specialism and then more broadly. To confirm that we still and have for a number of years maintained our position of road policing officers 18, intrinsically supported by 54 armed response officers who have dual responsibilities, but we have the added advantage, certainly in Norfolk, of having same levels of equipment and same focus when they're not responding to necessarily responding to armed incidents, to be focusing on the roads. And what we also have done over the last number of years is reinvest some of the surplus into additional officers. So we have the 4 motorcyclists, and I'll mention some of their activity, the collisions reduction team, the road collisions reduction team, that we fund through that surplus, but they're an integrated part of roads policing in the county. So if I may just take us through some of the highlights. I think, as I think I've said before when I've introduced papers such as this, there are 3 key elements in terms of road safety. There's the educating road users. There's the enforcement element that we clearly have primacy, and then there's engineering. And then we work with partners throughout, be them the county council, be them highways agencies, and the wider blue light and other agencies to work together to continually focus and bring, combined efforts to keep the roads of Norfolk as safe as possible. I think we actually talked a little around some of the challenges, or the Chief Constable talked a little around some of the challenges that we have in regards to our ability to respond. We know that our road network, predominantly rural, we know that safer roads are those that aren't rural roads, the kind of A11, which is a relatively safe road in terms of its construction. So we are challenged by that, but that's not something we let challenge us, in the sense that we still have that focus on road safety. If I may just draw out a couple of key points around where we are in terms of partnerships. Recently, started to use and scope new technologies supported by the County Council, looking at their road data use of vehicles on the roads, looking at both our own hotspots. So where are our, when I say KSI, killed and seriously injured hotspots, because that's where we predominantly focus, but I'll mention that we don't always focus on those, but predominantly focusing on those and using better data to help us understand. So what else do we know around our road network that other partner agencies can help us with to move us, or to supplement rather, or augment our own data? And we're doing some quite interesting work at the moment with some colleagues from the County Council, who are using some of their data sets to understand how their road network's being used. Now we can start overlaying that in terms of not only how the road network's being used, but where those dangerous and hotspot areas potentially currently are, or where they'll emerge. So we're doing some further work around that, and that also then gives us opportunities collectively to educate the public, in the sense that these are busy areas, these are the things that you need to do and you need to think about. I think we mentioned before, and it's probably worth just mentioning now, some of the proposed changes around the highway code and the kind of difference in hierarchy will be very much part of that process in the combined road safety performance groups, around sharing and educating people, particularly those that have in cars and or lorries and buses and the bigger vehicles, in terms of giving other road users the prominence and how that hierarchy will change slightly. I suppose it brings me on quite nicely then just to talk a little bit around the use of the roads. And in the paper itself, I think I would like just to highlight that actually over the last year or so, we've seen falls in traffic volumes. And of course, that's relates to some of the COVID lockdowns, people bringing COVID lockdowns and reducing the using numbers of vehicles on the roads. What we did see in part, and I think we reported this previously, that we were seeing on average road speed going up on some of those monitored roads, down as a consequence of less vehicle density, i.e. more space for the vehicles that were on there, which was concerning for us. We've seen a reduction in road and traffic volumes, and continually to do so. That said, it is starting to increase again, so you'd expect that to be the case, but that's down. If I may just bring us in terms of, we know that our KSIs, so in addition to the road usage coming down, we have had and again, the Chief Constable referred to it in part to a question that was asked, reductions in total KSIs and reductions in fatalities. Very pleasing to see. And in part, I would argue, fewer people on the roads, therefore fewer opportunities, but also we've been very, very heavily involved. What I would say, and the paper quite rightly highlights it, and I suppose I just would like to just go through a few points around this, that unfortunately there's still a disproportionality when it comes to vulnerable road users. Again, referencing an earlier question, we know that over half of our KSIs involved with vulnerable road users. And when I'm talking about vulnerable road users, it's the same conversations we've had before around pedestrians, cyclists, motorbikes and mopeds, and we're doing as you'd expect us to do in terms of concentration of our kind of collective effort. So what are we trying to do to reduce those kind of impacts around be it motorcyclists or others? Well, we do a lot of work with our partner agencies, be it the County Council, on safe, and again, I'm probably echoing a number of the points made before, but the safer rider courses that we do each year, the RCRT very much involved in that, not least because they're on their motorbikes themselves. We do an Operation Hawk patrolling motorcycle routes. So again, we know within the county that we have a number of quite enticing roads for motorcyclists, should I say carefully. So we'd identify them, particularly around the bank holidays at summer, because there's some lovely places to visit in Norfolk, as we all know. So we particularly focus on those routes for motorcyclists. We also then engage in, so for argument's sake, the Wheels Festival in Great Yarmouth, make sure that we have a presence there, make sure we, attend where we think gatherings are, and there are a number of local pubs where motorcyclists we know gather on a Sunday afternoon or the like. And again, we focus very much, we will turn up with our motorbikes and engage with and continually educate. We monitor spontaneous events and attend where appropriate. And, we're working, promoting attendance, carry on with our kind of events at the Snetterton racetrack as well at Superbike weekends, which again, we know are great draws. So particularly around motorcyclists, but others, again, the Chief's talked about close paths for cyclists, but again, the focus isn't on the cyclist, the focus is on the car driver or the lorry driver doing those continued works. And again, I refer back to the point I made around using better data, so understanding where we have a coming together of or a propensity for more cyclists on our road networks, particularly in our more built up areas, where using that sort of data allows us to focus our activities around such things as close paths and the like. And we continue more generally to do all sorts of activities in terms of supporting the campaigns throughout the year, where we have additional focus. I mean, as I said right at the beginning, the core function of our roads policing unit is to keep the roads safe. So although I'm going to probably mention now a few of the initiatives, I don't want it to sound as though we only focus on initiatives. Our core function is to keep the roads safe, keep the roads open, and actually using some of our roads network, denying criminals the use of the roads, of course. But we do a whole range of different things. So we do national campaigns where we look at either whether it's seat belts or mobile phones or speeding a very high priority, part of that fatal 4, drink driving, drug driving as well, and campaigns around Christmas, as I think we've reported previously. We do, as we did coming into the late autumn, Operation Dark Nights, making sure that we tackle, is your vehicle ready for the winter? A whole range of different activities and initiatives where we're focusing both on the driver, on the vehicle, on the road, to make sure that we try to get ahead of the kind of clear impact that a serious injury or a death on the roads creates. So yeah, and again, in the paper itself, it talks a little bit around some of the data around some of the campaigns. I think I just would raise. I think I've, again, whether here or in previous or at different forums, mentioned that the changes, the piece of case law relating to mobile phones inhibited the issuing of tickets a little. So you may or may not remember, but there was a piece of case law, I think from memory, RV Barretto, where we had to show that the actual mobile phone was being used for a communication purpose, as opposed to it just being used to be looked at to watch something or to be messed about with, for want of a better description. However, we still are able to, although it won't necessarily always be reflected in mobile phone issuing of tickets, but clearly if drivers are not focusing on their road, then we would use other parts of legislation, for argument's sake, not being in proper control of a vehicle, for argument's sake. So we're not letting that slow us down, but it doesn't necessarily always refer or referenced in overall figures for mobile phones. I may just briefly mention and then probably come to conclusion. We are, we use a range of speed detection. So we've got fixed cameras and average speed cameras, as you're well aware, and of course they are known on the road networks. We also use our traffic officers where appropriate to do speeding checks, and then we also use our the mobile vans and the community enforcement vans, and we have combined 7 of those across the county. The mobile vans, just again for colleagues' reference, mobile vans are the bigger vans with the cameras in, and they are predominantly focused on the KSI hotspots, i.e. on the major roads where we know serious injury and death has occurred in the past. And then the community enforcement vans are slightly smaller vans. They're easier for us to get into more potentially more rural and or urban locations, depending on where we want them to be, and again directed by concerns that are raised by local communities. You'll see sometimes those strips that we put out onto, well, we don't put them out, but the county council put them out on the roads, which then give us a measure. Doesn't tell us what, or it's not an enforcement issue, but it gives us a data set of travelling, and you'll note that there's normally 2 across the road. Therefore, it gives us an average speed between the 2 little things you drive over, which gives us an indication of the percentage of speeding vehicles, which then gives us a foothold for us to do some enforcement activity, and we do that. And of course, the COVID, the point around speeding, it's as much about education as it is about prosecution. So we direct many. We'll give the offering of the speed awareness courses, and there are still an outstanding number of courses to be completed from last year, which clearly pass on to this year. I think, Commissioner, I could probably go on for another 20 minutes, but I think I'll pause there and invite questions. It's still very much a focus of the constabulary, and I know a focus of your office too.
No, it's certainly an item that's on my radar simply because of the casualty toll that we're dealing with. So, I'm encouraged by what you say, particularly about the numbers. One area that is in my mind is, I'm not quite sure how to present it, but it's the difference between perception and reality. I'm getting a certain amount of correspondence at the moment from parish councils in rural villages to do with speeding through villages. It refers to lots of fatal accidents, lots of seriously injured. And actually, if people are interested listening in on this call, if you go to a recent article in the EDP, it shows the locations of all the serious accidents in 2020, and it shows a graph of the KSI, which backs up what you've been saying, Simon, about the numbers and so on. Nevertheless, there is this view, perhaps at parish council, town council level, that there is a major problem, which is a perception over reality question. Talking to community speed watch groups, it's quite interesting that they say, yes, there are some people speeding through villages, but they tend to be people who live in those villages, who are perhaps overconfident in the use of the roads immediately around their houses. And I just wondered what we might do in terms of comms with those parish and town councils to try and perhaps, it's part of your education programme, if you like, pass back the reality of what's going on. Because I recognise that you're wanting to use constabulary assets on an evidence base. Their counter to me will be, well, there are lots of problems, but we don't have an evidence base that underpins the actual deployment of your resources. How do we get around that conundrum and that presentational issue?
Thank you, Commissioner. I think I'd firstly say that we do need to, there's two sides to that particular debate or particular point. Clearly, we need to focus our attention county-wide on reducing serious injury and death, not least because of the huge impact it has on the individual or the individual's family. We're dealing with serious issues here. However, I do take the point you make that actually speeding, it is, and I tread carefully here, quite antisocial, and it's that speeding which feels, particularly around early morning when children are walking to and from school or coming home from school, when the wider community is more visible. You are right, though, to say, and I smile wryly to myself, that when we do this, the vast majority of whether it's community speed watch or whether it's enforcement or whether it's just words of advice happen to be local residents actually. So I think you're right that it is very much an issue of education. Now our local beat managers and our local community officers generally across this and do have in part the facility to undertake some of their own speed checks, and or if it's so significant, bring in other assets, not least the road traffic policing unit. But I do take your point actually, and it's a careful point to make, because what I'd never want to say is that it's not an issue, because if it's an issue for members of the community, it is an issue. So that's why I suppose I try and tread slightly carefully, not to suggest that it's minor in comparison. It's about making sure that that we do communicate, and I'd suggest that the conversations and that ongoing debate is directed primarily towards our neighbourhood beats, of which we, as Nick has described previously, you know, we're well blessed. I'll probably pause there because I'm probably overrunning a little, bearing in mind we've still got other papers to go.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. I probably didn't phrase the question particularly helpfully. I was sort of wrestling for words, because it is difficult when you talk about perception over statistics, because as you say, for the people who perceive there's a problem, there is a very real problem, and that's what's provoking very genuine and perfectly reasonable correspondence. But it's going back and reassuring them that just because there isn't a speed van parked in the middle of their village every day at appropriate times of day doesn't mean we're not on the case.
We're not, and what I know you mentioned community speed watch, and there's always opportunities for us to look at where that community speed, if people are, have that ability to support the community speed watch, and community speed watch does have an impact. It is that ability then to send letters to people, and as part of that direct and focused education, because you're just talking to one individual, through letter.
Grand, thank you. Anything else on that agenda item? I see no hands going up. Grand. Let's move on then to item 9, the Professional Standards Department complaints update. Who wants to lead on this one?
Yeah, if I may, I'll take that one.
Please, Simon. Thank you.
I'm just orchestrating my papers to the right point. I think.
Yeah, we start at page 66. No, it's before that actually.
56, I think I'm on. Is it
56? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Can't
there.
read my writing.
Yeah, I'm there. If I may, I'll start by saying this paper, as always when we bring this to this particular meeting, is data rich. I hope that gives you some reassurance of the scrutiny and the oversight that we give and the importance that we give to all things complaints. It's something that I personally oversee and have an opportunity to speak to the head of professional standards on a weekly basis, dealing with not only the serious, but of course we do, but also the minor and the opportunities to learn. It is a very data-rich paper, and although I could probably draw out 3, 4, well 15 points, I suppose, what I might do, given the, we've only got half an hour, and I note, Commissioner, that there are still a number of items on the agenda. Would it be easier if I just invite you to note the paper and then invite questions? Would that be helpful?
I'm happy with that. As you say, the vast majority of the paper is the data, and we have discussed this in the Strategic Governance Board, so I'm content. Happy to go straight to questions, and I'll start, I think it is on page 66. Well, actually, bear with me. Yes, it is on 66. It's that chart 5, and a question we discussed at Strategic Governance Board, so I'm asking it now in the public arena. That top line, which obviously is much longer than any of the other lines, police action following contact, accounting for 25.7%, if I've got my figures right, of all complaints. And I just wondered if you could talk about the causes and whether this is something that we can reduce in a reasonably short order.
Absolutely, Commissioner. I think two things there. I think because we've discussed it before, and because I'd looked at it before, it prompted a discussion with the head of professional standards, who's now going back to make sure that we're recording it. So our interpretation is not over exaggerating the particular issue. So we're now having another look at our interpretation against the IOPC guidance in relation to that. So that's the first point. We're not far away from the national average. We're 3-4 points above the national average. So we are looking at that. However, when it comes to police action following contact, there are a number of areas around that, and I think the paper references a few examples. Quite properly, what the Chief Constable is stressing through all of our interactions is that the victim, the witness, the member of the public has to be at the very forefront. So in general terms, a lot of our activity is towards the challenge that we've got here around the follow-up. So the follow-up around crime, to make sure that the victim of crime is aware of what we're doing, even if it is a slightly protracted investigation, to explain what we're doing, to follow up on the back of an initial response, what we're doing with their incident. So throughout the organisation, there's a focus on ensuring that that we maintain and continually and vigorously chase up outstanding actions and activity, and actually when we're not, it is an opportunity for us to kind of learn again. So when we do get that complaint coming in, it's an opportunity to resolve that particular issue, i.e. because we haven't done so, we generally service recover and make sure that particular issue is resolved, but also feedback and use those as examples. But more generally, we are looking at and are continually supporting our officers to get back to members of the public, victims of crime, wherever it happens to be, in an appropriate and timely way. But we're very much on it, Commissioner, and it's clearly raised as a consequence of this.
No, thank you. And that leads me to my other point, and in some respects, I think you may have just answered. It's the table on page 69, table 3, I think it is. Just scroll down to it. Yes, table 3. It's that the bottom line there, the percentage of complainants contacted in more than 10 working days. And I was struck by the difference between the figures in 2020, 2021.
If I can give you some reassurance, it was an issue that was spotted some time ago. Again, not least because using the data to help us direct activity, it was something that was spotted a while ago, and a case was made for some further resource in that kind of early intervention, that early contact. And I can report that actually the October and the last period, then the last period of reporting, Q3 of 2021 into 2022, effectively, that's gone up to 73.4, which is higher than it was in the whole of the last year. Now, I accept they're the only 2 dates that I can give you, but to reassure, we spotted that we've got a problem there. There was a staffing issue with demand. There was a staffing issue, not least there was some COVID issues going on in and around all of that particular part of our business. However, we've looked at that. We've decided that it's not only does it give a better service to those that are wishing to complain, the public more generally, but actually early contact is a far better way of managing the whole of be it a complaint or an early resolution or early intervention resolution. Not least, we all know what it feels like when you want to complain and you haven't heard anything. You become ever more antagonised. So it's something that we've seen. We see it as an opportunity for us, by investing there, to help us both manage and give better satisfaction to the public, but also to manage down complaints coming in and also the protected nature of some of them. So reassure you, it's on the up. I haven't got the last quarter, which I need to look at. We haven't quite got that yet, because clearly we're still in it. But when I do, I'll be in a position to report back.
No, thank you. Reassuring. And then a slightly different point, moving on, it's the last paragraph of page 84, where you mention reflective practice. And I just wondered how often we're using reflective practice, what we think the benefits of this approach might be over what I'll describe as more traditional styles of discipline. I'm thinking in terms now of learning for officers and the wider force.
Well, ultimately, Commissioner, what we want to be doing is giving a good service to our public, first and foremost. You know, and there is something that says, in an older style way, that if you punish somebody, do you necessarily get a change in behaviours? You actually get a punishment or a fine or whatever else. This is all part of the change in the process around complaints handling, in that the organisation, the service, saw that there was greater benefit, greater public benefit and greater individual benefit from not jumping to sanction when it wasn't appropriate. Don't read those, please, that we don't have an ability for sanction. There are still things that officers do require a sanction all the way up to, and all the way up to sacking and beyond if it's a criminal offence, of course. So I'm not suggesting for one moment that we've softened where there's a necessity to stop damaging and detrimental behaviours. However, a lot of our interaction policing is that kind of face-to-face interactions with people in times of stress, where we sometimes do, and quite properly, need to stop people doing certain things and moderate others' behaviour. Becomes conflictual, and therefore people do complain. Now, of course, we welcome that. We welcome the complaint. If we've done something wrong, we'll look at that. But it's also, for me and the wider organisation, an opportunity to sit people down in a structural way to say, look, this is what you did, this is how it impacted on the individual, this is how it impacted on them supporting the constabulary, this is how it impacted on the confidence of the wider public, or whatever else it happens to be. So in terms of your specific question, and there are two sides to it really, there's the defined reflective practice as defined in the new police standards regulations around how we do that, and we've done that formally 10 times. So where behaviour required improvement, we've addressed that through a whole range of, and those reflective practices are not necessarily prescriptive, they are dependent on and subjective regards to the actual incident. So it could well be, you know, a course, it could well be an apology, it could well be some sort of action planning, it could well be a whole range of different things where individuals then reflect upon what they've done. However, we still use, you know, we still expect our leaders, our first line leaders, our sergeants and our second line leaders, inspectors, certainly in that operational space, to be challenging and inviting other colleagues to reflect on what they've done, whether it reaches the threshold of a complaint, a schedule 3 complaint, and therefore an outcome being reflective practice as defined. So we encourage and learn, and hopefully, you know, as an organisation that learns as much as we can, as often as we can, to sit down and have those informal reflective, because we codify everything, don't we, in the police, but those informal reflective practices, those informal sit downs where a sergeant would say, no, didn't do that very well, these are the reasons you didn't do that very well, I'm now monitoring that, be it informally or even outside this process on a PDR, on a professional development process. So we do use it, but what to your question specifically, we've used it 10 times between, and the data I've got, 10 times between April and September of last year. So over a 6-month period, 10 times.
Graham, thank you. I think that's all I've got on that agenda item. Anything else anyone wants to raise? I'm just mindful of the clock, although we are doing reasonably well. If there's nothing else, we'll go on to item 10, the Emergency Services Collaboration Update. And as I did last time, I'll begin by noting that the 2017 Policing and Crime Act places a statutory obligation on us to collaborate with the other blue light services, and in our context, particularly with Norfolk Fire and Rescue. Who'd like to lead on this, which is we do have a report at page 96.
We, Commissioner, we do. I'll just pick out a few points from that report, but probably pertinent to say actually that at the very practical end of collaboration, in the last few days, we've had a real example of where collaboration is vital to the constabulary in terms of our response to homicides that have occurred in the west of the county. I, for obvious reasons, I won't go into the details of the cases, but the response to those homicides has been led by our joint major investigation team that we share with Suffolk Constabulary, and the fact that we have that critical mass of investigators because we've pooled our major investigation resources together has meant that we've been able to deal with a incredibly rare phenomena of two homicides on the same day, and that's the practical benefit that this that this collaboration brings to us. The paper does contain a detailed summary of all things collaboration, both at national, regional and local level. The key points I would highlight is that in terms of making best use of the taxpayers' pound, since 2009, Norfolk and Suffolk Police have saved between us £41.4 million as a result of our collaborated efforts. And it is the case that we share more police staff in collaborated posts than we have in single force functions now, really driving efficiency over a period long over a decade now. In terms of the years ahead and activity ahead, some of the major collaborative programs I would highlight in particular would firstly be the Home Office-led Emergency Services Mobile Communications Programme. In short, that's a replacement for the radios that officers carry on their day-to-day duties. Whilst the project is Home Office-led, there are local implementation teams that are in place. The replacement programme will see a significant cost for the constabulary, which we are planning into our budgets, but it's a cost that is worth highlighting. In April this year, the constabulary goes live with the Police Education Qualification Framework. That's the new entry route into policing. We are partnered with Anglia Ruskin University, who will be providing much of the student officer training for our staff. The whole intent of that programme, again, a project that we've undertaken jointly with Suffolk, the whole intent is to ensure that police officers are given the vocational skills that will enable them to deal with the challenges of modern day policing. As said, we go live in April, and that programme is well and truly on track. And then finally, I would just pull out, because it links to earlier discussion points, work that we've been doing within the region around vetting. There we have been piloting a regional robotics approach to vetting to enable us to speed up the vetting of new staff, and to also have the capacity to go deeper and further, looking at the histories of individuals that might wish to join us, so that we can root out those who have no place in policing. That programme is ongoing and on track. Perhaps finally as well, I'll just touch on the digital asset management system. In effect, that's a repository whereby we can store the growing volumes of digital data, make the ingestion of that easier, so that the transference of material from whether it be victims or witnesses is simpler, and so that officers can then get their hands on it and proceed with their investigations in a more timely manner. That is expected to be delivered in September 2023, and will bring real efficiencies to the force in terms of how we store, in terms of storage costs, but also utilise digital data. I think the rest of the paper speaks for itself, but for the purposes of today, collaboration with other police forces, other partners, fire services is just critical to the efficient running of the service, and we have an ongoing programme to exploit collaboration in the years ahead.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got no supplementary questions. Anything from the floor? I see no hands, which is great. Which brings us to item 11, emerging operational organisational risks.
So from a constabulary perspective, Commissioner, in many respects we've touched upon them during the course of the meeting. I alluded to two high-profile incidents we had at the weekend. I earlier mentioned the constabulary's response to the COVID-19 situation. The not really an emerging risk, but the issue that I'd always look to flag up is we continue to see a significant impact on being caused by mental health on the delivery of day-to-day policing, and indeed the broader health system, but most acute mental health. Sadly, it is too often the case that individuals who should be being cared for in specialist mental health beds are being held up in custody suites because those beds are not available. And it is often the case that our officers, when coming across persons in crisis on the streets, are being delayed in their transition across to mental health provision. The main concern with that, obviously, is it's not good for patients. But the secondary concern for policing is that we are dedicating a growing amount of our time and resource responding to mental health issues and incidents, where you'll be aware that our demands are themselves significant and growing. I wouldn't say it's an emerging operational risk. Frankly, it's been a risk that's been present for a number of years now, but in recent weeks it has become more acute. As you would expect, I do have regular dialogue with relevant partners in that regard. I do have some real sympathy for the position that they find themselves in, but it's creating a challenge for policing that it's probably appropriate for me to flag up today. Thereafter, I don't think that there are any other risks that I'd wish to share. I'm just looking at my colleagues on the call to see if there are any others from them, but I'm seeing shaking of heads.
No, thanks, sir. Just going back to the mental health one, are you able to give a percentage of capacity that's used by mental health calls?
It's incredibly difficult to provide an accurate figure on that. In years gone by, we have carried out exercises where we've done a deep dive into 24 hours worth of calls, looked at the background of the individuals calling us, because sometimes it's very obvious that it's mental health and you can tell within 5 seconds of picking up the phone, but quite often the call may be driven by mental health, but it's not very obvious in the first instance. So call logs are not routinely tagged as mental health when reality could show that they are. Some of the metrics that we could share at a later meeting would be the number of individuals who are being sectioned by police using 136 powers. We could provide data on the number of times the police are being asked to assist at section 135 warrants, and we could provide data on the number of times that mental health patients are being detained in custody, and if you wish, we can provide that out of meeting. Harder to prove, but I would suggest that there will be a direct correlation between the growing number of missing persons reports that we're receiving and also the mental health picture. But my professional view would be there's a strong link. Providing the evidence of that correlation may be a bit challenging, but should you wish to discuss it at a future PAM or SGB, then we'd be happy to share some of those metrics with you.
No, it'd be useful to do so. I'm just conscious that some of the personalities have changed over in our partnership organisations, and I'm keen that I speak with the same voice as the constabulary when I engage with those new leaders, and indeed more widely through things like the Public Sector's Leaders Board and the Community Safety Partnership. So it would just be useful to be on the same hymn sheet statistically.
Yes, and I should add, I think Nick will probably come in on this point because he leads on it, but I should add that we sit on the right forums, we have the engagement, and I'm sure there's a joint willingness to solve these problems. But I'm keen that, without neglecting our wider duty of care responsibilities, I'm keen that the focus of policing is on policing related matters, driving down crime protecting our communities, providing visible policing, it's increasingly the case now that it's other demands that are non-core policing activity that's preventing us from doing that, and hence I just flag up that risk. But Nick, I don't know if you want to come in.
Commissioner, I would just support what the Chief Constable has said in terms of the impact, but I think the point that would probably be most helpful to the public really and to yourself is that we are fully engaged with our mental health partner colleagues, and I sit on the strategic group that is looking at some of the issues within the crisis system that we've got in terms of supporting individuals with mental health challenges. And our dedicated inspector, Joe Walmsley, sits on the operational tactical group in terms of trying to tactically solve some of the issues. And certainly 2 of the 4 priorities that we've got at the moment relate to the Section 136 capacity. So that's the suites where police officers can take somebody who needs to be assessed to see if they need to be given treatment or detained under the Mental Health Act. And that is a priority for us to deal with in terms of its capacity and the impact that that has on us. And also the second one relates to the 12-hour performance limit that hospitals have within A&Es. You've got to be seen within that 12-hour, that health service, Ministry of Health target. We've been able to secure agreement that they will also look at that in respect to those individuals that are detained in our police investigation centres as well. And that's actually really, really significant importance, because they do spend an awful lot of time, effort and energy in terms of that 12-hour A&E target, the DTA target, and to be able to get the PICs into that state, that as well, is really, really important. So I'm really pleased that I've been able to secure that with partners in terms of prioritisation.
No, that's really good news. I wasn't aware of that point about the PICs. That's a good step forward. Thank you. Simon, your hand went up and went down. Are you content your point's been covered?
Yeah, all I was going to raise was a more general point around some of the work the College of Policing have done around time spent on issues such as mental health, but I think it's well covered. It's not, I suppose the point I'm making, it's not just a Norfolk issue, although it's particularly acute here. It's a more general issue, and the percentage of time that we are able to focus on what the wider public might traditionally think are policing duties is ever more compressed as a consequence of doing other things quite properly, because their raison d'etre is very much around, keeping people safe in whatever guise that happens to be. But I suppose the point I was raising, or would want to raise, is that we're across it, we're looking at it, certainly from Norfolk, working with our partners, but it's not a uniquely Norfolk issue.
Right, thank you. Okay, if there's nothing else on that item, let's move on to item 12, any other business. I have no other business to raise. Is there anyone putting a hand up from the floor? I see no hands going up, which allows me to move swiftly on to item 13, it must be, the date of the next meeting. Programme for the 26th of April, kicking off at 10:30. I'm conscious we've only got 2 minutes left. I think we can draw the meeting to a close on time. And Paul, as ever, hugely grateful to you and your team for all the work that has gone into today, into drafting the reports that have been produced, and for the information that's been provided today. As ever, huge thanks. And for the home team, likewise, for their part in setting up the meeting, preparing papers et al. If there's nothing further, I'll draw the meeting to a close.
Thank you.
1 minute early. At least we're not 1 minute late. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.